Thank you for joining Gwinnett County Public Library for our Meet the Author series featuring author Alicia K. Jackson. My name is Miriam Mayer and I am an adult services specialist at Gwinnett County Public Library. Tonight we are joined by author Alicia K. Jackson in discussion of her book, The Recovered Life of Isaac Anderson with Professor William Thomas Okie. Before I introduce our guests, I would like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. This is a Zoom webinar, so you will only have a view of our guests and your microphone will be muted. There will be a Q&A at the end of the program, so please feel free to type in your questions into our Q&A box. Now I would like to introduce our guest for tonight. Our moderator tonight is Professor William Thomas Okie. He is an associate professor of history at Kennesaw State. He serves as associate editor of the journal Agricultural History, and his work has won prizes from the Society of American Historians, the Southern Historical Association, the Agricultural History Society, and the Georgia Historical Society. His first book is The Georgia Peach: Culture, Agriculture, and Environment in the American South. Our author tonight is Dr. Alicia K. Jackson. She is an associate professor of history at Covenant College in Lookout Mountain, Georgia. She currently leads a student-based research project known as the District Hill Cemetery Project. With most of the grave markers are gone, the community-based project focuses on recovering the lost history and stories of a vibrant Black community located in Southern Appalachia. She has written for the Washington Post and the History News Network. Among her recent publications include Having Our Own, the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, and The Struggle for Black Autonomy in Education, which was published in Southern Religions and Southern Cultures, Essays Honoring Charles Reagan Wilson. She was awarded a Louisville Project grant for researchers in 2016 for her book, The Recovered Life of Isaac Anderson, published by University Press of Mississippi. Please welcome Alicia K. Jackson and William Thomas Okie.
Thank you, Miriam. And thank you, Alicia, for inviting me to be part of this. This should be really fun. Hello to all you viewers, listeners out there. So we're going to kind of do this as a kind of conversation. I have some questions that I prepared for Alicia, and we'll talk through some of the themes of the book, and she'll get to tell some stories. And then there'll be some time for Q&A at the end. So what I'd like to start off with is just a question about your background and what got you interested in history, how you ended up at the University of Mississippi. Tell us a little bit of that spark moment that got you excited about history.
Yes, thank you so much. And I appreciate you being willing to be service moderator. In terms of my interest in history, I think it was a lot of it had to do with stories I heard growing up, and the stories were about family history and sort of talking to the broader sort of experience. And I just always have been fascinated with history. Even at one point I had thought I'd wanted to be an archaeologist, but then decided no. I had read the stories about King Tut's tomb and the curses, and that kind of deterred me from wanting to do that necessarily. But anyway, I just have always been curious about the past. And so that has, and I think a lot of it has to do because of my growing up. Anyway, for a period of time, I thought I went to law school, as a matter of fact, for a semester. I realized that was not for me. But I've always been fascinated with hearing history and learning about history. And so that led me to become a historian. And University of Mississippi, what led me to attend that university is because of the fact that when I attended there, Winthrop Jordan was there. As a matter of fact, I got to take a class with him, Nancy Burkhaw, Charles Eagles, Sheila Skimp, of course, Charles Reagan Wilson, and then my dissertation advisor, Ted Owenby, were there. And so it was just a phenomenal group of people. And I was really interested in how they were so interdisciplinary, and that it wasn't just history in the book. It was like a history that you could almost feel, taste, touch. And so I just really appreciated their approach to history and the way they looked at it. So that's why I chose the University of Mississippi, branched out from my home state of Louisiana and moved over one state.
Now you're two more states over.
Now I'm two more. Yes. Uh-huh.
But you knew from the beginning that you wanted to do Southern history. It sounds like there was a regional emphasis already from early on in your life.
Yes, I was really fascinated with history of the Deep South, and so I like currently now I teach a New South class, so I look at that. So I like to understand whether it be Appalachia or looking at Cajun culture or things, an African-American history, obviously. I just have a real interest in the Deep South. So yeah, that's part of the reason why to stay in this area as well. So interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because this is not my list of questions, but I'm going to go on a side tangent for a second, but just because this is very related to the book. I mean, it's called Recovered Life, right? Like this idea of unveiling something and I wonder if that's part of what drew you to history. It's like this investigative, like there are secrets, right? And you have these really interesting moments in the book. One of them is at the beginning, one's at the end. We can call them archival serendipity moments. They're like these you just happen upon a little piece of paper or a clipping of some sort. So I wonder if you could kind of talk about that origin story for the book and your interest in kind of unveiling things that seem like they have been kept hidden.
Right. Well, I think it goes back to my children want to be an archaeologist, right?
Yeah.
So there's like the mystery in putting those pieces together. And so, yeah, I think that is what I've always been interested in. And so one of the things I sort of see myself, whether it be with this project or the next project I'm working on now, is this whole act of recovery. And so I just think it's so important to tell the stories that we, for whatever reason, have not been told. And so, yeah, so initially, when I was working on my dissertation, I was looking at the CME Church, which was founded in 1870. And when it was founded in 1870, it was founded by as a sort of an offshoot of the daughter church of the Southern Methodist Church, because the Methodist Church had split over the issue of slavery by 1850. And so the Southern Methodists were part of the creation of the CME Church, which is called the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. It's now known as the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, and it's still around now. So my dissertation focused in on them, their founding and the late, what was going on in the denomination, late 1800s. And so one of the longstanding arguments has been that the CME Church was not political. And so part of my dissertation was looking at the church's involvement in politics. And so when I was visiting Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee, I happened upon a brochure put together by a descendant of Isaac Anderson. And one of the things, as I was sort of flipping through this little brochure, mentioned that he had been in politics. So it was a direct contradiction to what lots of folks had said about the CMEs. So anyway, so it listed that in there, and then it listed that, so it listed that in there. So I wrote that in my dissertation. And in my dissertation, I've probably talked maybe a couple of sentences, maybe a page or so on Isaac Anderson. And I thought I'll look at that maybe later. But it still percolated in my mind. So I started my new job at Covenant, and then I was like, I just was curious about that. So I went and sort of fell into the rabbit hole of researching Isaac Anderson and went back to that document. There it listed that his father was William Jackson Anderson, and all of these things were listed in there. And I kept thinking, should I know who William Jackson Anderson is? I mean, they sort of listed it there almost like, you should know who this person is. So I tried to find information on him. And anyway, it ended up being well over a decade-long project. of working on recovering his story. And so that was sort of like you talked about, sort of a serendipity moment. And then in the process of researching the book, I was able to meet a phenomenal historian from Fort Valley. Her name is Marilyn Wyndham, and consider her a friend now. Anyway, she had put me in contact with someone there who was going to help me maybe do some research on some deed work and some property work, that kind of thing. So I was talking to him on the phone. And then when I came out, she said, you're not going to believe what I found. And I said, okay. So she said, this is the last file I have to do, because she was working on the archival room. And she said, this is the last file I needed to put away. And I found this. And when she opened it up, it was William Jackson Anderson's obituary. And wow. It was amazing. Yes, it was an amazing moment. And I like to attribute this to genealogy, with this phrase to genealogists. I've heard a number of, I listened to a lot of genealogist podcasts. I learned so much from genealogists. And I think in many ways they have, in the historical field, sometimes we've overlooked them because they do phenomenal work. But anyway, I heard a genealogist talk about this. I think it might've been Bernice Bennett. She said, that is when the ancestors want us to, they're speaking to us. They want us to find them. Yeah. And so it's almost like I felt like, okay, this was a part of the story that needed to be told, because for the CMEs, they really don't have an archive. I mean, they do have an archive, but it's not like Isaac Anderson has no papers.
Right.
There's no repository of papers I can go to. There's no diary, there's no ledger. It was all recreating and recovering his story.
Which is, I mean, I don't know how many of our guests know about what historians do, but typically we're taught to go to like the big fat stack of sources. Like that's like, you want to build your project around the big, the 40 linear feet of papers in the archive, right? So I think it's really a testament to your determination, but also kind of your DNA as a historian, right? That you kind of are drawn to these these silences, right? These stories that are there but are not well documented.
Mm-hmm. Most definitely.
So did you know from the beginning that Isaac Anderson's father, was that part of the brochure, that his father was white and a white planter? Well, he wasn't a planter, he was a merchant, but yeah.
Yes, so he said he was a descendant of William Jackson Anderson. So I knew that. And then I was able to contact one of Isaac Anderson. Well, I've contacted a number of Isaac Anderson's descendants. And so, but I didn't find out that it was sort of the complex relationship they had until much later on. But initially, again, it was sort of descendant, sort of raised questions in my mind. The other thing that was particularly interesting is there's no reference to his mother. Mm-hmm. So, and that was always an interesting question to me. Why is his mother not mentioned? Because in most slave narratives, there's oftentimes some reference to a mother, Frederick Douglass, there's some kind of, that's right. Very common to do that. So, yeah. But it was just
and you think that he probably didn't really know his mother? Is that your best guess?
We just don't know. I don't know that any of the descendants know either. What was that? So that's one of the silences there. That in some way that was not transmitted to the family. That this would happen to his mother. So
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that relationship for people who haven't read the book. Like, there's this whole period, for example, when William Jackson Anderson, the father, keeps Isaac Anderson as his, like, calls him his Negro man, his slave, right? And doesn't set him free. And you think maybe there's that there were maybe good reasons for that, not just, I guess, talk about some of those complexities of the father-son relationship as much as you're able to find.
Yes. So, yeah, so that was really interesting because not only was his father a merchant, but his father was also involved in the slave trade. So that's the other thing that's complicated about this. And this is, of course, a time when people would use slaves as collateral. So they would, so that's one of the things. I mean, there is that possibility that happened with Isaac Anderson. But either way, yeah, it's very complex because of the fact that, and that's why I needed to find more than just the family saying this. I needed to find other points of contact. So when that was the thing that was so amazing about the obituary, because in the obituary, he references Isaac and he references his man Isaac. Yeah. Also to when it comes to property, it's Isaac Anderson who buys property from William Jackson Anderson. And then when there is the connection with the pastor of the Fort Valley Church there's a reference to Isaac Anderson going back to his former master. So there are these things, these other points of connection. But part of the reason why, I mean, I don't know exactly why he didn't free him, but I talk a little bit about this in the book. But if he was emancipated, he would have had to leave the area. He would have had to leave Georgia. And for probably some of the viewers are familiar, if not with the book, with the film, 7 Years a Slave. The Solomon Northrop book. So it was very common for people to be kidnapped. And as a free person of color, there was the reality that you could be kidnapped and placed enslaved somewhere else. So I think that's a reality. Also, too, it wasn't easy to do that. You had to make it very public why you were going to do this. And as a person who is well known in the community, you would, you'd have to give a very public recognition of why you're doing this. And there are cases of people who've done that, who did that in the past, where they publicly recognize this particular person as their son or daughter. But there's all that sort of community, that sort of open community recognition of, that this is your son, your Black son. Mm-hmm.
And then he goes on to lend money to his father at some point, right?
Well, yeah, in the obituary, he referenced that his father's, he references to his father references in his obituary that he went to his man Isaac for this loan of money. But one of the things that the family talked about, Isaac Anderson's family talked about, was the fact that Isaac Anderson did work for his father's, had his father, was a merchant. So that he worked in his father's store. So that could be a part of it. I mean, it's just not all, I don't know all the ins and outs of the dynamics. Sure. Again, we just don't have that's one of the silences in the story.
Well, so for people who don't know who Isaac Anderson is really, maybe could you give it like a few highlights? Like, what are some of his achievements as a leader throughout the course of his life?
Yeah, sure. So Isaac Anderson served in the Georgia Constitutional Convention from 1867 to 1868. And he served there. He's originally born in Monroe County, Georgia. That's what he lists in the Constitutional Convention minutes. That's where he said he's born. But he lives a good portion of his life in Fort Valley. And he would, again, serve in Georgia Constitutional Convention. He would run for the Georgia legislature in April of 1868. And he would run as a Republican. And this is a time when, this is the relatively newly formed Republican Party, where it's a party of Lincoln. So African Americans in large numbers are supporting the Republican Party. And so this is a time too when the Democratic Party is very closely associated with the Ku Klux Klan. Very, very close relationship between the two. So anyway, Isaac Anderson runs for the Georgia legislature. He loses that election. And then he goes on to become, briefly, for a little while, he is a part of the Well, he had served for a brief period of time in the AME church, but he goes on and forms the CME church. And he's one of the founding members, leaders of the CME church. Eventually, in 1870, he would win election to the Georgia legislature and serve in the Georgia Senate. This right after his father had been removed from office, he ends up taking his father's seat, which is, I don't know, in any other case where you have that historically ever happening. So he wins his father's seat in December of 1870, and also forms the CME Church as a part of the formation of the CME Church in 1870. The thing that's remarkable about that 1870 is that in 1870, pretty much the rest of Georgia ends up becoming under Democratic control. But this one little region is where you see Republicans are able to win that area. Eventually he's forced to leave Georgia because conditions in Georgia are such that there's the rise of the convict lease system. There's legislation that's passed directed towards him that would possibly place him on the chain gang in Georgia. So he flees Georgia and moves to the promised land of North Mississippi. Mm-hmm. Lives there for a period of time. And then eventually by 1890, when you have, not long after 1890, Mississippi passes the restrictive laws that essentially disenfranchise Black Mississippians. He eventually relocates to Jackson, Tennessee, and there he spends the rest of his life there. And he's a merchant like his father. Anyway, that's where he ends his days there, and supporting Lane College.
Is Lane College a CME college originally?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, so you mentioned this phrase, Mississippi as a promised land for African Americans in the late 19th century, and I'm sure that's a surprising notion to a lot of people. I think it's relatively well known in U.S. history, the story of some of the great migrations and northern cities as kind of promised lands, Detroit and Chicago. But talk a little bit more about these kind of intra-South communities that were created in the Reconstruction just after that era.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think all throughout the South, and I think historians are growing sort of attention to these areas. But probably for most people, they may be familiar with them in the context of maybe like Mound Bayou would be probably one that most people are familiar with and thinking about Mississippi. But one of the things that happens is that the Freedmen's Bureau had sort of preliminarily sort of set up some things there. And there were places that you could homestead land on. And so before the Freedmen's Bureau ended. So I think that sort of turned people's African Americans' attention to looking for land, sort of places where they could live. They're remembering that 40 acres and a mule idea. And so one of the things that happens is in Georgia, African Americans have very limited political rights. So for example, in Georgia, it's not until I believe 1980 when you have the first African American elected to a statewide office. In Mississippi, it's different. In fact, in Mississippi, you have Black individuals. Your first Black senators come from Mississippi, U.S. senators. So Mississippi at this time is a place for opportunity. So for African Americans, not only is it political rights, so the right to be particularly able to vote and serve on juries of mixed race juries, but also this economic opportunity. One of the things that you see, particularly in the Mississippi Delta region and sort of the outskirts of the Mississippi Delta, is that there was a need for labor. And so the need for labor was such that they were willing to extend political rights to African Americans if it meant that that would draw African Americans to those areas. So you have Black individuals from all over the country, Washington, D.C., in other parts of the South as well, who relocate to places like Sardis, Mississippi, Panola, which is Panola County, also Marshall County, where Holly Springs is located, because they have political rights, economic rights, and then also opportunity to education.
Okay.
So the number of schools there, like Rust is there. And also there's a teaching school that's also in Holly Springs as well.
Okay. Very cool.
Yeah.
This story reminded me a little bit of Mildred Taylor's books. Are you familiar with the Mildred Taylor, some of those novels?
Yes, I saw that question and I was like, oh, it's warm my heart. She is my favorite author.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Talk about Mildred Taylor. Well, so for listeners or for viewers, there's a story she tells about called The Land, which has to do with one of her ancestors. And you might be able to summarize the story better than I can, Alicia, but one of her ancestors who's mixed race, whose father is a kind of a powerful white man. Mm-hmm. And he ends up, the story sort of follows him as he figures out where he belongs, but also as he looks for land, like a piece of land to buy and own himself. And it's a really interesting story because all of her books are interesting, but you kind of get this picture of the South that doesn't fit the sort of movie South mold, like the sort of agrarian African-American South. So you can talk about Mildred Taylor, but also about the importance of stories that don't fit the sort of established frames for talking about the South during this time period.
Yeah, I think, and I will say, I think for like when I tell my students, so I will say I did assign my book to my class. I taught the second half of African American history in the spring. So I signed the book because we had to talk about Reconstruction. And so I think for them, they were really surprised about this idea about Mississippi. And I think what happens is because people, and rightly so, Mississippi does have had a particular reputation. And I will say this as a person, I have lots of family in Mississippi. My dad's from Mississippi. So I say this with a little bit of I can say this because I've got a connection. But yeah, Mississippi, there's a reason why Mississippi has that reputation. I love my people in Mississippi. So just in case, it's like in the South, you realize that you never know who's in the room because there's probably somebody's cousin in the room. So that's why I'm saying that. I'm saying that about Mississippi, just in case some of you are like, wait a minute. But I do think that, the films we watch, the things I think that there's certain stories that that's what we expect. And so I think that's part of the reason why doing these kind of deep dive projects are so important. And, I will say that I think that for a lot of people, that's probably the reason why I wanted to write a book that was seemed approachable to people. So it wasn't so high-minded academic that people who weren't academics would be like, okay, I don't understand what's going on. And that's why even at the top of each page, at each chapter rather, I put a timeline. Because I think it's important for people to have a sense of that there are lots of stories out there we just don't know about for whatever reason. People just didn't talk about them. And I will say, and this is one of the things I bring up in the book, is some stories are hard to tell because they're dramatic. They're really hard stories to tell. And so I think that's part of the reason why sometimes those stories aren't transmitted to another generation. And we're such a mobile community, society. People are different places, so we don't, share those things as well. So anyway, I think it's just important to do those kind of deep dives and that kind of work. And I know for you with your work, in terms of your, the work you do, I'm sure there have been things that you share that are sort of, that are broadening an understanding.
Yeah, well, one of the connections I felt with your book was, I have a chapter in the Georgia Peach book about Fort Valley, but also I describe it as like a braided narrative. It's a story about Henry A. Hunt, who was not the founding president of Fort Valley State University, but sort of the one who really got it going.
Mhm.
And he was like Anderson. He could have passed as white. In fact, one of his brothers did teach at UC Davis for years as a white man, and like there was this unacknowledged family connection. But then one of his sisters was married like the I forget what it was now, the president or someone involved with Tuskegee. So it like very clearly threw her lot in with the African American struggle in the South. So yeah, I was just fascinated by that. Those stories were not the kinds of stories that I knew growing up, right? They scrambled some of the binaries that were and some of the kind of like moral binaries too, right?
Yeah.
Those are really difficult choices.
Well,
For me is Mark Schultz, The Rural Face of White Supremacy, which is about Hancock County. And it's, again, this very complex story about race relations in Hancock County and all these ways people cross the color line openly. The one thing I remember is that they never ate together, but they slept together. There's like, that was okay. You couldn't eat. Anyway.
Exactly. Well, and that's one of the things that's interesting about William Jackson Anderson and Isaac Anderson, because it's so complex. I mean, one of the things that I was talking to I was going to talk about the book earlier this year, and folks were like, "Oh, he was just such this evil, horrible, evil person," and I'm like, "Well, it's more complex. I think that's just our human nature. We want everything to be black and white." Mm-hmm. And yes, there are some terrible. I mean, this is his son. He owns his son. He supports his father. Is a part of a political party that is, very much opposed to black leadership. Very much supports the convict lease system. All those things, but at the same time, there are vestiges of things that he left his son, whether it be the amount of education, the things that he gave his son, whether it be his love for education, which because William Jackson Anderson supported women's education and education in general. His father was a superintendent of schools in Fort Valley. I mean, he's a superintendent of Sunday school. His dad was a merchant, all these things. And he taught his son how to be like a bookkeeper, because he essentially, at the end of Isaac Anderson's life, he did what his father did in the sense of being a merchant. Mm-hmm. And so there are these things that he did there. The family story is that before his father died, he left Isaac Anderson money so that Isaac Anderson could become, do certain things and helped him as he moved from Mississippi. So there's this really complex, so you want to make William Jackson all bad, but then there are these other things that are just like, wait,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Any I know this, I didn't read this in the book anyway, but was there ever, did Isaac Anderson ever have a chance to try passing as a white man?
Not that I know of, but from all the indications he could. And because he was very, 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 very fair complected. And as a matter of fact, when I talked to one of the descendants years before she passed, she was the initial descendant I talked to, who really helped me to understand a little bit more about Isaac Anderson's life. She told me she had a picture of Isaac Anderson's father and a picture of Isaac Anderson, and they looked so much alike that, I mean, they could almost, you would just think they were the same person almost. I mean, and they would because the skin complexion was just very, very similar.
So one of the things that was interesting in this book, I think, is that kind of gets at this tension, and maybe it's in all histories, but in African American history, there's this kind of tension between maybe radicalism and incrementalism. So you have like Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X, right? Or W.E.B. Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington. And it's an oversimplification. It doesn't really quite map onto those individuals. But I think it's a really interesting question. I enjoyed that students really latch on to, and I'm sure you've had this discussion as well. But you're in an unjust situation, and the options before you are, initially the students always want like resistance and burn it down and that kind of thing. Then you have these other stories of people like Booker T. Washington who sort of played along. He seemed to sort of say, okay, we can be unequal socially, we can be separated, right? And he got a lot of white money, and he built an institution that trained a lot of Black teachers and professionals. Anyway, I wonder if you could talk about that tension in Isaac Anderson's life, maybe, but also it sounds like this is part of the CME story, like working within the system versus directly challenging injustices as you see them. And
Yeah. So yeah, definitely. I think this is so much a part of the African American experience. And I mean, I'm sure other groups have similar experience, but the whole idea of wearing a mask. I mean, within I think Douglas talks about this, Frederick Douglass talks about this, but how, if you're talking to a white individual, and I know Du Bois talks about this for sure, but you have to say certain things, and the Black, you can be sort of more open about things, but you have to wear this mask. And I think for a number of African Americans, if you were going to stay in the South, you would have to wear a mask. It was essential. And I think you didn't maybe as much in the North, but there's still a measure of wearing a mask in the North as well. So I think within the CME church, there were folks who wore a mask. I think people like Isaac Anderson wore a mask until they didn't have to wear one anymore. So, but then there are other folks in the CMEs, maybe Lucius Hosley, who sort of adopted some of those ideas and really used more of that rhetoric. And so I think for most people, when they think of CMEs, and people who are not really familiar with sort of the intricacies of the history, they think the CME church is more like Lucius Hosley, because Lucius Hosley talked positively of slavery, and talked about slavery being a great tutor and all that kind of thing. Well, most CMEs, I think he is the only CME I've heard talk like that, leader. All the rest of them were like, slavery was horrible. It was a nightmare. It was, and so, but that's sort of the story that people have latched on about the CMEs, sort of what Lucius Hosley has said. And so, but when the CMEs got to the point where they could get property, or where they had the means and the money to do things, they did what they did to separate themselves out. And they were intentional about calling themselves the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, not South. They did not want to, they were Colored Methodist Episcopal. They didn't want to put that South part to sort of associate themselves with the Southern Methodists in that regard. They were very intentional with Lane College, that this was a school that had a board that was comprised overwhelmingly of Black people. And that would sort of kind of differentiate themselves from Payne. So they were very intentional in that. And so I think that sort of that negotiating is very common to the Black experience then and as is now. I think for a lot of African Americans, the story of Isaac Anderson is very familiar, because the idea that you have sometimes to work within a system that you do not agree with, until you can get to a place where you can have, where you can be free, you can have your own carved out spaces. And I think that's part of the reason why I think the book has some resonance today. And I think even with Charles Blow, his book that came out last year, The Devil You Know, I mean, one of the things that Blow talks about in the book is, one of his advocates about moving down South, even though there are problems in the South, is this is a place where there are things you can do within the system to challenge the system. This is a place where there's sort of a space where we can carve that out. So I think the arc of African American history has always been looking for safe spaces and places where they can carve out community and have voice.
Yeah. Well, that gets us to a question I wanted to ask. There's a clear sense, and I really enjoyed this about this book. It was very different than a lot of history books. That you were writing this book and experiencing the present, and that's like, you're there in the story. Um, and I'm interested in hearing you talk about the sense you had of maybe like a kind of emerging relevance or importance of Isaac Anderson. Like it's almost like an acceleration as you know, 2016 election of Donald Trump, high profile police shootings, the January 6th riots, like as these kinds of things were happening, how did you experience that dialogue between the historical stuff you were studying and the present?
Right. Well, it is interesting because, okay, so I started the project well before 2016, right. But it was, and I think to me, this is part of the reason why Reconstruction is so important. The period, and I think a lot more attention has been drawn to the Reconstruction period. I mean, Henry Louis Gates, of course, had his series, and there's been lots of other books and things that have drawn attention to it. So I'm glad this book can kind of be a part of that story, you know, unpacking that story. So for me, Reconstruction was a period where there looked like there was a moment of sort of possibly racial harmony, you know, where you have African Americans who, you know, have leadership and economic opportunity. And then it just seemed like everything, like things just seemed to just sort of almost not fall apart, but seemed that the promise that was there, it just seemed to be so much fracturing in society. And so for me, I think it was very disconcerting. You know, and it was interesting. I was on a panel the other week, and we were talking about Reconstruction. And one of the things I had wanted to bring up with them, in light of the work that they're doing, and particularly as scholars of color, but even if you're not working on Reconstruction period, it's almost like it can be such a challenge, because you kind of hope like we have moved past some of these issues, but we're still dealing with them. And I think that was and that didn't happen until later on into the book when I was actually writing it. But, you know, one of the things I talk about in the book is also talking about the fracturing within the church, within sort of the broader Christian community, and the implications of that here. I mean, we're dealing with that today. So, I mean, there's so many things about it that were not intentional that just sort of like came to the surface. And so to me, the book is relevant because I think it helps us to understand where we are today and why history, and I know this is probably, you feel the same way, history is so important. And it doesn't need to be taught by people who are just trying to get dates and numbers and things down. It needs to be people who are wanting to share the history so that it can be available to everyone and tell the dark parts of history and the good parts too. There are good parts of history as well we could talk about, but give a full breadth of it, of what history is all about.
Yeah, no, I think you convinced me. Like I have been frustrated with teaching Reconstruction in the survey class. I teach the second half of the U.S. survey, and we start with the end of Reconstruction, and I think the traditional way of doing it is kind of a congressional story, like it's a national politics story. Mm-hmm. And I think this book, along with some others like A Nation Under Their Feet by Stephen Hahn, mm-hmm. this kind of like lived experience of Reconstruction, I think that's the way I need to go as I teach it in the future, because I agree. I think it's a hugely important period. Mm-hmm. One last question is just, it's clear that your faith has informed this book and the research that you did for it. And I wonder if you would speak about that a little bit.
Yeah. So, I grew up attending a Black church, and very, very much a part of my growing up. And whether it be in New Orleans or whether it be in Cairo, Georgia, my connection to the Black church has been really deep. And part of the reason why I wanted to look at the CME church again for that reason. And so, through a lot, it was, I know probably for most folks, it's not an easy process to to work on a book, but also to get it published, to find a publisher and do all that. And so I really feel like, I think the book, so I feel like my sort of faith plays a role in that, in the sense that I believe that this is something that, it's part of my calling. To write this book and to make it available to people, and so and in that way, in many ways, it sort of infused my faith, infused the writing of the book, and so that definitely played a role, and also too why I could have the insights I had about what was being experienced there as well. Mm-hmm.
I said that was the last question, but I really actually have one more. Tell us what you're working on now. This you did this research a long time ago. This book, now that it's published, you're ready for something else. So what's the next project?
Yeah, so I am now looking at the African American community and so much for Southern Appalachia, sort of connected to my District Hill project. And so I've been really fascinated to look at how African Americans negotiated, challenged, work within a system or within a society that's primarily known for Klan activity, and how those communities would not only survive, but oftentimes thrive. So anyway, I'm in the process of doing oral interviews with folks and that kind of thing. So I'm enjoying that a lot. I love, it's recovering again.
Yeah.
I enjoy interacting with people. I love research. I could spend all day in a research and look through microfilm, but I also do love hearing and interviewing people, hearing what they have to share. So.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, I think I think we can open up to questions now from viewers. So I'll try to follow along in the Q&A in the chat here. So we have a good question to start off with, which is, how do you get started in researching a historical figure who doesn't have a lot of information readily available? How did you told the story about how you first heard about Isaac Anderson, but yeah, what are some of the techniques of tracking down, of recovery?
Right. So this is where I give my kudos to genealogists. One thing is looking through census records, doing all that work, looking through newspapers, that kind of thing, but also if there are people who are descendants, contacting them and finding out what materials they have, and what information they have to sort of help you to be able to put that story together. Because sometimes they have papers, they have, for example, the Andersons' descendants had the family Bible, and some other things as well that it helped me to sort of guide me into some places to look. So those are some things that I would say.
I remember someone describing it as a kind of like as building a chain. Like you talk to one person and then they give you two other names, and you talk to those two people and they give you three, like you're kind of building this web, and it takes a long time, but it can be really fun.
It does. Well, and that's one of the things, like, so for example, I have a whole chapter on William Jackson Anderson. Well, again, I don't have a lot on Isaac Anderson, like his own papers, and I don't have William Jackson Anderson's papers, but the Anderson family is a very large and very prolific family. And so they have a whole book on the Anderson family. So I was able to trace the lineage and go all the way back to the Revolutionary War to get a sense of the family history.
Did you use ancestry.com or a similar like genealogy sites that preserve census manuscript data and that kind of thing, or is that less helpful with this kind of story?
So what I did was I used Heritage Quest, and then I later on I used Ancestry. I'd used that, and then also too I talked to local historians. William Mills is a local historian from Central Georgia, and I never met him, but we corresponded back and forth because he had a website talking about African American history in and around Houston County and Peach County. And so I contacted him, and then he told me about a whole bunch of sets of things that I didn't even know were available. Family Search is phenomenal. It's free. And it is a great resource. So I would highly recommend that. You just need to register. And there are lots of things there. Sometimes it's a lot of hunting and looking, because not everything is straightforward. So it takes a lot of looking.
We have a question about your theory of what happened to Isaac's mother. We don't know, but what's your theory?
I don't know. I mean, really, she could have died in childbirth. I mean, that could be one of the things that happened to her. That's one of the things I'm thinking, maybe leaning more towards. But it's really just, I don't know. And the family doesn't know either. So Isaac Anderson had 2 wives. His first wife died. And so that lineage, I haven't been able to get in contact with a lot of that side of that lineage. I did talk to one person. She gave me, because she was trying to find out about her second, third grandmother, because they didn't know anything. And then his second wife, they didn't have really a lot of information on that. So it was there's a lot of stuff that there are a lot of question marks, silences.
Silences, yeah. Other questions from the viewers? I'll build on the first question. So as you're gathering this information, how do you organize it? How do you kind of keep a quote unquote database, or and put it into a narrative, deciding the chapters, stuff like that? Talk a little bit about the craft.
Right. Yeah. So for me, what I did was again started collecting information. I did almost like a family tree of both of them. And then it just took me a while to collect information. So it took me a long time. And so eventually, once I was probably like 4 or 5 years into the project, again, because it just took me so long, then I started writing. I felt like I had enough to be able to start writing. And I started thinking about, and my husband worked a lot with me on this. I will say I'm so thankful. I married an English major. So that was really helpful. He loves to read. And so he loves, especially listen to books on tape. But anyway, so he's always into stories. So he really helped me to think about telling a story that's engaging, and his ideas compelling. And so anyway, so he helped me, because a lot of things, I am just so much like fact driven. I'm like, okay, I need to make sure I get all this in there. And that is why my footnotes or my endnotes are really chunky, because he's like, you just need to put that. You need to put that in there. So people who want to go and find out more, they can go and find out more, that kind of thing. So, but that's how the process, that's how it went. Where I did a lot of writing, he reviewed it, he helped edit it and that kind of thing, and the whole process. But it took a long time. And yeah, and then in those moments where I'd find things. So for example, I found a document at Drew University. I happened to be at Drew University for a conference and didn't realize it at the time, but Drew University is the archives of the Methodist denomination, the United Methodist Church.
Oh, okay.
Went there, was looking at that little archival, little display, and guess what I saw when I was walking through there? I found this reference to the first CME general conference held in Georgia, which was very essential to telling the story and some of the things that were going on, that they had the program there. And so I just happened to find it while I was there. Again, remember I told you about the genealogists say that's when the ancestors was? Yeah, it was like, that was like, and that was, again, a very key part of telling the story about Isaac Anderson. So it was those kind of things all throughout the project, where I had hit brick walls and then something would come up.
We got a tough question from Deborah Harvin. She says, when do you anticipate publishing your next book, since your studies require so much detailed research?
Hopefully it will be a lot less than 10 years. Hopefully. I'm not sure, but it has been, I have just so enjoyed that. And I'm still in the process of doing those interviews with that project. So those are ongoing. So, yeah, there's just a lot. Yeah, I'm just so excited about the other stories I had the opportunity to tell.
Yeah. Are you, with the oral history project, are you transcribing the interviews, or are they housed in the Covenant College Library or something like that? Or what, how are you dealing with that aspect of the collection process?
Yeah, so at this point, I'm still working on, figuring out about where they're going to store it in terms of archival. I at this point, they're oral interviews, and so I have them, I'm taking lots of notes, but then also I have the recordings. So I'm doing that, and then the idea is that in the fall, I'm scheduled to teach a class on that's dedicated specifically to looking at the Black community in and around Chickamauga. And so the idea is that I have about 4 historians, budding historians there, who are signed up for the class, and we're going to do a deep dive. And so anyway, so that'll be great, because the other thing too about that's so important to me, and I think, and I'm sure you understand this, because not only are you a historian, but you're an educator, is to get people excited about history. And so it's so important for me to have students where they can do the work. So when I did the District Hill project, I had students go and research the people who are buried in the cemetery where there are virtually no markers. There are some markers, but research of people buried there. And so for my students, they had already been learning about African American history, but they learned about, people who were business women in the community, or people who, did all these different things. They were washerwomen, but they had their own little business. So anyway, the class in the fall is to get students in the history, local history, and also to give back to the community. I think it's very important as historians, for us not only just to, produce things that are going to add to the field, but also to give back to the communities and make those available for folks. So.
There's also, maybe you're thinking about this as well, there's a whole literature of course, scholarship of teaching and learning, but specifically about oral history as a tool. And I could see a really interesting article from the District Hill project and your work with students, and kind of like how being out in the community and encountering those stories changes their view of history.
Oh yeah, and I have had a number of them tell me that already, that they are so glad. Like, I've had some students email me and say, I really didn't I had to take this class because I had to take it for whatever reason. And I came out and I'm just like, I just have such a different understanding about history after, especially doing that project. Yeah.
I see Miriam again. Are we?
Yeah. Well, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A or the chat, so I think we are going to wrap up our program. So I just want to thank you, Alicia and Tom, for this wonderful in-depth conversation of a historical figure that I don't think a lot of people know about. So I definitely learned a lot about Isaac Anderson, and I think you really painted that picture of everybody's story matters. And it just takes like one person to start asking those questions and start digging up that information, that history, and just to see that impact that he made with the Black community in the South. So thank you so much for this book, and I can't wait for you to write about another historical figure that we don't know about. So I'm looking forward to that. So again, thank you everyone for attending the program tonight, and we really appreciate it. And we hope to see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. Thanks, Alicia.
Thank you both.